Welcome to the Nonprofit Exchange Podcast. Stories by leaders for leaders to help you raise the bar on your own excellence, to release the potential inside of you. Now, here's today's podcast. Greetings. Here we are again, Nonprofit Exchange. We got another really good session today. Russell, we're going to focus on the unique issues around church leadership. You and I know some about that, being inside this the space of the church and working with them. So how you doing, Russell David Dennis?
I am in the middle of all sorts of new things. We are rolling into a new vision at my church. And so there are all sorts of things, everything from A to Z, from change to conflict. And in the church environment, that's a big unique. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of Jim's insights on this. Sure.
Yeah, he's got a lot of good things for us. He and I've had a chance to chat, and he comes highly recommended from my wife, who is
brains of the operation.
The brains, that's right. She's a chairman of Jim's fan club. So without us getting too far afield, Jim Chandler, welcome to the Nonprofit Exchange.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you today.
We like to ask our guests to talk a little bit about themselves. It's interesting. It's a lot more interesting than me reading a bio that's kind of flat. So tell us a little bit about your background. And I know you're ordained clergy and you spent some time in the church and you're doing something different than that now. And just a little bit about you and how you arrived at what you're doing now and maybe why you've chosen to do what you do now.
Okay, yeah. Well, I grew up in North Carolina, and my family was part of the church. We were there every time the doors were open. When I was a teenager, the people were telling me, you're going to be a pastor, and I kept saying no. When I went to college, my plan for my life was to be a lawyer, and went to UNC in Chapel Hill and double majored in economics and political science, did the pre-law track. Matter of fact, when my wife agreed to marry me, she thought she was marrying a lawyer. So it was the classic bait and switch. And after college, I was working, managing some businesses and really was saving money to go to law school. And there was just something in my heart that I think I'd been suppressing for a long time, and finally said yes to it. Went to seminary, was ordained, and pastored local churches for about 30 years. Had the opportunity to plant a brand new church in the Richmond, Virginia area, and just really enjoyed being a pastor and working with different churches. And a couple of years ago, felt another redirection in my heart and life. And for the past 2 years, I've been working as a coach and a consultant with pastors and churches, and really focusing on helping lead into what the church needs to be in the 21st century. And so I work with establishing some brand new churches, and also do some work with pastors and churches that have been around for a couple hundred years. So it's a good variety of work.
Wow. So what makes Jim Chandler unique? You said words that a lot of people use, coach and consultant. What's different about what you do?
Yeah, the reason I really felt drawn to this was, there's a lot of coaching, there's a lot of consulting out there, and there's a lot that's being offered to churches. And one of the things that I saw a lot of was what I call the template approach. And matter of fact, there are things that you can get. You can buy a package online, download it, change out the church's name, put your name in, and I won't say that doesn't work for some people, but I know it doesn't work for a lot of people. And one of the things that I believe to my core is that every pastor is unique, every church, every community is unique, and I love, rather than taking some template and trying to put it over what they have, really working to find out what's what's unique, what's the call to be present in this community.
So looking back on not being a lawyer, and being a pastor and taking the ministry track, any regrets?
No, none at all. And a matter of fact, for years, I kind of had this back and forth with God because I was wondering why those years were wasted studying like economics when, I went to become a pastor. And rather than thinking those were wasted, I think they have been critical to the work I did as a pastor and the work that I do now. And I love leadership. I love, reading about and studying leadership. And the more when I was pastoring that I read and studied leadership in the non-church world, in the business world, the parallels for what we were dealing with in the church were just so obvious. And I think sometimes church people are resistant to some of those leadership principles that, they're for business, they're for people who are not a part of the church, but they're the principles that really do transfer. And leadership is leadership.
And Bishop Williman was at my leadership symposium recently in Lynchburg, and he got up and said, nothing happens without leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he was bishop in North Alabama for two quadrennia. And then he's back at Duke teaching clergy, and he's focusing on leadership because he said it's the biggest deficit he sees in the church.
Yeah.
And you and I talked before, and there's several things I'd like to unpack here, but the Methodist Church, I don't know what the current number is, but our former bishop visited our local church a few years ago and threw out the statistic that the United Methodist Church was losing 1,200 members a week at that point. And, it's still going down in numbers. And I just shared with you that I attended a national conference and the numbers were very low. And it was focusing on church growth. And so and people there said it was a downward trend, that people were not coming to that particular conference. And so underneath that, you and I had explored what's underneath that. And from where I sit, where Center Vision Leadership Foundation is called, is to help people empower themselves to be better leaders. What do you think the core deficit is in leadership? And are you of a different opinion than me that we're losing members? The heart of it is lack of leadership.
I agree with you. And what Bishop Williman is doing now in teaching leadership is so needed, because a lot of seminaries, maybe even most seminaries, you can go through and get your Master of Divinity to be ordained and to pastor churches, and leadership isn't taught. And so much of seminary training, it's important. You learn biblical languages, you learn to preach and teach, but then the leadership skills that are necessary, because the church is one of the most leadership intensive organizations around. In most churches, there's not enough paid staff to do all the things that need to be done. And to live into the mission of the church, you're dependent upon people using the gifts and talents that they have to serve without any financial remuneration. And a lot of seminary training teaches you to do, not to lead. And I think that's one of the struggles that churches face, where the pastors, the professional clergy, or I call them, sometimes I say we're the professional Christians, and we're trying to do everything rather than use the skills of effective delegation and really empowering other people in the church to lead.
Generically, Russ and I find that the burnout rate with nonprofit leaders, I think the Meyer Foundation did a study, said it was at 45%. I would imagine that if you go to clergy only, it's higher than that.
Yeah, I can't quote the exact percentage, but I have been reading some things lately that just talks about the dropout rate among clergy that's high, and it's getting higher.
Some of the stats I've seen and repeatedly is that 1 out of 10 pastors make it to retirement,
Hmm.
which is alarming.
Yeah.
Alarming. Now, you chose a different path. I chose a different path. I'm in my 3rd career, and I timed out after 40 years in the church, which I think I did what I could do in 40 years. Now I'm working as an external president, sort of similar to you, but I'm more generic nonprofit. So um, church, I'm going back to a soundbite that you gave us. The church is the most leadership intensive place to. My goodness, unpack that a little bit. What are some of the specific challenges? I think you have 4 that we had talked about before. What are some specific challenges that church leaders face? We're talking about clergy, but it's more than clergy, really.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and you and I had this conversation a few weeks ago that I don't know that any of these challenges are unique to church leaders or to clergy, but they're specific to them. Another challenge that along the leadership lines is this thing of trust and the erosion of trust in clergy and in the church. They're just here in the last couple of months. There've been a couple of big things that have happened. One of the largest Protestant evangelical churches, one of the mega churches, it's gone through a tremendous crisis because of allegations of sexual misconduct by the lead pastor, led to his early retirement. And now, because of the church's mishandling of that, the whole governing body, stepped down. Everybody reads about that. Just hit the news last week with another scandal with a priest in the Catholic Church, and where being a clergy leader, there was a time where you were the most respected person in the community. And now when you see lists of how professionals are viewed, maybe I didn't become a lawyer because I wanted to be really respected. But you see used car salespeople and clergy near the bottom of the list. And one of the challenges around that is systems of accountability. I think it's a struggle within the church to have that positive accountability. At one end of the spectrum, you've got no brakes, and driving a car without brakes is fun for a while until you come on a curve. Then it's a disaster. And then at the other end, it's more like a parking brake. And if you've ever tried to drive your car when the parking brake's engaged, it's really hard to make forward progress. But to have a leadership structure where the accountability that we all need is there, and so that there can be trust in that, but also allows the forward movement.
That brake thing reminds me of trying to drive in Mexico. Why use your brakes when you have a horn? Or Italy, for that matter. So this you're talking about, and it's all over the news. So it's Bill Hybels you're talking about in that church, and then the Pope came out just recently denouncing the sexual impropriety. There's a leadership paradigm that we hardly ever look at, and that's the power differential that psychologists talk about. And Russell, our colleague, David Gruder, and I've taught this together at business growth conferences. The pastor is in a unique position, and there is a specific power differential. When you read the research, like what you're referring to, that 40% of pastors admit to sexual impropriety, to having an affair. That's admitting to it. And so it is a high stress, high risk job, and then unaware of how, and it was consensual. Well, no way, you're in a power position.
Right.
And even subtle ways, when pastors are leading worship, they tell people everything to do. like they're talking about a program rather than leading worship. And then they'll say things that are power words like "you may sit down." So we reinforce it in subtle ways and actually make it worse. So talk about us in a position of influence as leaders. And we're talking about leadership in the church specifically, but many of these themes, all of these themes, are good leadership is good leadership anywhere. But we're focusing on some of the issues specifically with the church. And was it fair to say the mainline church is what we're mainly looking at today? So that's where you
Right,
work.
right.
Where I have most of my experience.
Yeah, and I think again back to accountability and having some healthy practices in our lives. Somebody, it's been said a lot that leadership is lonely. It's lonely at the top, and it can be. I think if we make it that way, I don't think it has to be. One of the struggles for pastors is taking time for themselves, being healthy, making sure that they are not allowing themselves to be stretched so thin that they're susceptible to things that they otherwise would not be. And one of the things that was so key for me, and I still have it in my life, is some people who not only have the invitation, but I give them the expectation that they're going to just speak truth into my life, and sometimes tell me things that in the moment I may not want to hear, but I need to hear, and just recognizing that all of us need some healthy accountability. Otherwise, we'll go places that we wouldn't ordinarily go.
I'm rereading some of Napoleon Hill's writings. Do you know that name?
Yes, I do. Yes.
And he's talking about the 500 leaders that he interviewed. And Thomas Edison had very little education, but he surrounded himself with very knowledgeable people.
Mm.
And so it was this mastermind concept. And Andrew Carnegie is the one that really turned him on to the mastermind principle. But we don't really, as leaders, we get in this lonely space as in a nonprofit executive director or pastor. And we really don't have this peer group around us. Part of it's accountability, part of it's nurture. And in the church, we preach the Sabbath, but we rarely take it ourselves.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So I read in the Washington Post a year or so ago that the mainline denominations have 23 Easters left at their current trajectory of losing members.
Huh.
And so looking at some of the, how much has the church changed, and how much does it need to change to remain vital? Or how much does the Methodist Church have to go down? It's lost a lot of members. What's the right size for the denomination? So what needs to change in the church? Because it's not on a good trajectory right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things is how we deal with nostalgia. There's still a lot of people around in the church who were there when the biggest problem was how do we build buildings fast enough to have space for everybody. And there are pictures on the walls of the rooms being overflowing, and I don't think we need to forget that past. It needs to be celebrated. We need to learn what we can from the past, but there is a point at which nostalgia gets expensive because it costs us focusing on what the future can hold, and it's going to look different. One of the things I really love about the work I do now is working with some new churches, and the model is very, very different than what it was 21 years ago when I planted a church. But recognizing that there's still so much good that needs to be done, and the church has a great role to play in that. But nostalgia isn't going to help us get there, because it's not going to look the way that it did in the 1950s, 1960s.
Russell, what do you think of that? Nostalgia. You've been around churches, I guess, big part of your life, haven't you?
I have, and I'm in a community that's different than any others that I've been in. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to comment to with respect to leadership for pastors, because the key role for a pastor is that they're the spiritual leader of that community. And like other nonprofits, to flourish and to operate smoothly, you need some business systems in place. That's an awful lot to heap on to one person, because both may not be in their wheelhouse. And so in order to avoid isolating themselves, having people that are truth tellers that Jim spoke to, he's got truth tellers in his congregation. Every one of us needs those people in our lives. And so that's really critical, And I don't think that in large part, a lot of leaders, not just in churches, but in other organizations, aren't really taught how to deal with conflict.
Yeah.
Conflict in the church is a completely different animal, because not only do you have to look at some of the standard paradigms for conflict, but for a pastor, dealing with conflict has to involve use of scriptures and other principles that other parts of society aren't holding themselves to necessarily. So that's really critical. And going forward, I mean, the church has to ask itself, what are we here to do, and what does that look like? I can speak to our church. We're looking at expanding our role in the community. And the church was there to be a beacon in the community. And I think that there's been a loss of sight of the fact that the church is supposed to be a beacon for the community with so many other things going on. So it's going to look very different. And like anybody else, any other organization, a nonprofit or business or church, we've got to look at what's our role. Are we fulfilling that role? What needs to change? And so there's a whole different dynamic. But like everybody else, we have to appeal to people we're trying to attract. So what's the message that's going to resonate? So whether we like it or not, we're in sales and marketing to some degree. What it is that we're selling, is different. And selling is, to me, is just service and solving problems. So that's kind of the role. That's a big part of the ministry, is solving problems wherever they are.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And Russell, I just wanted to follow up on what you were talking about with, the leadership systems, and I think that is so critical. One of the big challenges that churches are facing now is alignment. Their structure, aligning the structure with the mission. Churches that I work with, where we look at their structure, I break it down into two categories. There's church work, and that's the stuff that keeps the organization going. And, it needs to be done really well. But that's things, the administration, the finances, the, property management, HR, things like that. But that's not why the church exists. It's the mission and ministry why the church exists. And that's not church work. That's the work of the church. And what I do with churches is we look at how much time and energy they're putting into the church work side of it. Because a lot of times there's a structure that's been around for decades, and it's done nothing but grow. As structures tend to do, you just add different layers of bureaucracy, and it's really eye-opening when a church sees how much time and energy. And we look not just at how many meetings do you have, but how many people are in that. What's the person hours? What's the opportunity cost of that? And it's encouraging to see churches that are really trying to bring efficiencies to that church work side of it, so that there is more time and energy freed up to really live into why the church exists.
That's a lot of really good stuff in what you just said. I'm processing it. You, in the narrative, when you respond to some of these, you show a real depth of wisdom. You've been around, you've seen things, and now you're seeing it from the outside. And part of what I was thinking about when you were talking, when what you were saying, it was we were talking about our somewhere in their mission, and we get sideways in the church. We think the Great Commission is our mission, and I believe as a strategist, Great Commission is a mandate. It's a biblical mandate. It's not a choice. A mission is a choice. It's what we do after we make disciples. And so we want to make disciples. Now what? It's like the dog chasing the car. When they catch the car, what do they do? Yeah. So speak to having a profound vision. And Bishop Wills, when I worked with the cabinet when he was bishop in Middle Tennessee, he told me, I don't see anywhere in the Bible that God gave a vision to a committee. And so it's the leader's duty and delight to say, here's my vision. But I think as we run the vision down, what I've seen over and over, we run the vision down, it comes back up from the masses and the leaders emerge, then we articulate how we're going to do that, which is the mission. So we're making disciples. What are we called to do? So speak to that strategy and structure. And I don't know if that's a context that you are consultant and coach in. How do we rally behind what God's called us to do as this particular body?
Yeah, I love what you just said, because when you look at a lot of mission statements for local churches, they're the same. And oftentimes, that's, it's really because it's easy to take that biblical mandate that you said and just say, well, that's it, and not do the hard work of really looking at this community in which we are located. Who is here? What are the needs here? What are we gifted and equipped to do? And where I love seeing some of the things I'm seeing now is where churches really have articulated a clear vision and then are doing the work of making sure that they are aligning what they do with fulfilling that. And it's hard, particularly in an existing church where you've got dozens of committees and things like that maybe have been around for a long time. And there's still some people who, there's a few people who really love those things and don't want to let go of them. But, to look at in 2018, what are we called to do? Who in this community are we positioned to reach? And then what do we need to put in place structurally? What do we need to do to organize ourselves in order to live into that? And I do believe it's unique for every community.
It's like we're all different people. We all have different personalities and different talents. And so the communities are all uniquely different.
Sure.
And so that's really important. We have a comment from somebody watching, Karen. Thank you, Karen. I believe the drop in mainline churches is because it is a time of enlightenment and people are waking up to their spiritual connection with Source God. Dogmatic religion where you are told how you must believe or you will go to hell just does not resonate anymore, which is why new thought centers are growing and accepting all and help you find your truth and don't claim to be the end-all authority over you. It encourages you to find your truth and purpose. The seekers are seeking and just don't resonate with religion anymore. I find more and more people who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, which is kind of a shame. Our religion has gotten in the way of our Christianity is what I'm taking out of that. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's some truth there that, in the modernist age, it was the institution that was looked to, and the institution spoke, and people said, okay. And that's not our culture now. And actually, I think that's a good thing because it gives people the invitation and the opportunity to really dig and explore for themselves. Part of the issue with the church is still trying to live in that modernist age and function in that when the culture isn't there anymore. But I do not at all believe the church is irrelevant. I believe that there's great relevance. We just need to live into that. And I think the model of how we do church, this is back to how it's going to look different in a lot of settings. The church with one person who stands at the front and is the dispenser of all is not going to resonate with a lot of the people in our culture. It's going to be much more of a shared journey, participatory, and in the end, I think that's a good thing.
So going back to earlier, we're talking about what's working, what's not working. Contrast those for us. What's working? I mean, you travel to a lot of different places. I guess you've traveled there. You've seen a lot, but typically, what do you see is working really well with leadership in the church, and what's not working? You talked about this memory of the past and living there, but what else?
Yeah, I'm a little reticent to say this thing and this thing because our tendency is to say, "Oh yeah, we need to do that." Overall, the thing that I see that's working is a willingness to experiment. And, everybody knows that the church in our culture, is changing, has changed, is changing. And some, bury their heads in the sand. Some get freaked out about that. Others, though, really take a much more innovative stance and let's try some things. And knowing that some will work the way we think they will, some won't, but this willingness to experiment, and it's that trait that I think is working now. I see people experimenting with different things in their communities, and they're engaging with people that they were not in the traditional model of church. But again, this isn't just, okay, they're doing a pub theology, so everybody should do a pub theology, meet in the bar and have conversation. And I don't think it's programmatic. I think it's more a mindset of being willing to innovate and experiment.
That's fascinating. That's and you and I talked before we started about Father Gregory Boyle.
Yes.
And his work with those homeless people. Where is he, in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Yeah, quite remarkable. He just turns the paradigm around. He didn't try to fix them. He goes and he relates to them, learns from them, has conversations, values them. And we tend to have our little, and Richard Rohr says this, we have the social club that it's a country club mentality in the church. You have to obey these rules and follow there. Karen said, she didn't say the churches weren't irrelevant. I said that. I think they're relevant, but they don't resonate. So we've developed we talk about best practices, but we don't use them. Or we skew them to what we think they ought to be. Is that part of the nostalgia piece where we're not thinking, we're just walking through the motions of what we think it ought to be?
Yeah, and with that nostalgia, if you remember what worked really well, it's easy to just fall into, okay, we need to put more emphasis on that and just try harder to do that same thing that worked, a couple of decades ago, rather than really being open to, let's try something new. Let's try something, that's different, and to, just this cycle of learning that, we hear about in the business world, with think, try, and learn, and just this cycle of innovation, that's what we need in the church. is this, let's just iterate. Let's try something. What do we learn from that? Okay, now what do we learn? And one of the big obstacles for the church too is how we deal with data. Because data, numbers aren't the whole story, but you can't know the whole story without the numbers. Oh, wow. And there is this fear, I think, of data, because we feel like it's going to be bad. And by some of the traditional metrics, maybe they don't look good, but what can we learn? What is working? And, then let's try something, and, how are we going to measure whether it's effective or not? And it just, there are things that in other parts of our culture that, are done, and they're proven best practices. Sometimes we're just reluctant, probably for a myriad of reasons, to implement those in the church.
It's the 7 last words of the church. We've never done it that way before.
That's right. Yeah. And, when I planted a new church, one of the things that was eye-opening was how quickly into, a brand new church. So you're starting with a blank sheet of paper, and how quickly you would hear things like that being voiced. Well, we've always done it this way. I'm like, that means we've done it once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's scary, isn't it?
Huh.
Oh my word. It's, and we don't care. It's like the reporter goes in church and interviews the guy and says, what do you think of apathy and indifference? He says, I don't know, and I don't care.
Yeah.
So we kind of get in our ivory palaces. And we've toured a lot of churches lately, and just visiting, getting acquainted with them. And there's no millennials. There's no millennials. We've just completely, and I do think as a large, I've read in some studies that millennials think that the church does more harm than good. And back to what Karen said about spirituality, we don't really, aren't really aware of our spiritual being, and how God's called us, and how the Holy Spirit works in communities of faith. And so we're called together to do some good. And sometimes it's the war zone where we're picking on people. So
Yeah.
it's really, I keep hearing the theme of, let's try something different.
Yeah.
So when church calls you and wants to work with you, what kind of qualifier do you have to want to work with them?
That's a really good question, because sometimes it's desperation at the other end. We've exhausted everything, so let's try this. One of the questions that I ask in just the initial kind of we're vetting one another to see if this is going to be a good match is one is, what is it that you're called to do? And the second question is, what are you unwilling to change in order to pursue that, and just to try to get that out on the table, and try to do that without any judgment in that, but let's just be real. And sometimes where I'm not a fit is where a church is just wanting to keep things as they are, but just get more people to come and participate in that. Where I really, feel, my passion flowing is when, church, they are intent on reaching their community. They just don't know how to do it, but they are, they're not going to sell out what they believe, and wouldn't ask them to do that anyway, but they're willing to change tactics, willing to experiment with different approaches, willing to get out of their comfort zone in order to engage with the people in the community that they feel called to reach. And there are churches that are doing that. A lot of this, can make it sound like, oh gosh, everything is horrible in the church, and I don't believe that. I wouldn't be doing what I do if I believe that. But it does take a sense of mission and a passion and a willingness to do some new things. And well, the way I say it is to do things differently and do some different things, and a combination of those two.
Russell, I hear some hope in his words. You know, he's in this because he sees that there's a better future. What are you hearing?
Oh, there's a load of it. And I mean, if you're spiritually minded, you don't really have a choice. You can't sit on the sideline and just watch it grow. And the community that I'm in is a new thought community. And, you know, for a lot of years, churches thought of themselves as kind of middlemen for this relationship with spirit. And that's not the case. And people don't need a Minuteman. They need guidance and encouragement to see how this way of life can be put to practical use every single day. And that's what it's about. A lot of leaders are resistant to doing these things different. I'm sure that Jim runs into a lot of resistance. And I think a lot of that is fear. You know, seminary didn't prepare any of these folks for all of these extra roles that they have to play and some of the problems that are taking place today. But there are a lot of dedicated, spiritually minded people in church. We use Jim Collins' Good to Great model for social sectors to build our vision over the last couple of years, and it's worked very well. Every church has some what he calls level 5 leaders there. And so that pastor is the spearhead of that vision. That's where that initial vision comes from. It's usually pretty big and pretty scary. And the board supports that, and you go in there and you do the work, and you bring in the congregation, because the church is a community. And not only is the church a community within the communities that they serve, but churches are relevant in the community. And a lot of churches, as they shrank, you know, something happens when conditions get difficult. A lot of times as individuals, we shrink back instead of going full out to be who we are. And that happens with the church. You kind of lose pace of who you are and character. So we are relevant here in this community. And who are the people that we want to talk to? Who do we want to bring in? And who are our level 5 leaders? So there are a lot of questions out there to ask and answer. And, you know, to get something that I have never gotten before, I have to do something that I've never done before.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the challenge with churches. And so there are other folks out there. Karen Frank mentioned Ken Wilber, who's done a lot of church leadership books. And there are a lot of good things out there. But it's up to people within the church community to be open and willing and to support that pastor. With so much being put on that pastor's shoulders, sometimes they feel like they can't delegate it. I can't hand off my responsibility to be the spiritual leader, but I can sure as heck go out and hire a business manager. So I'm not fiddling around with day-to-day stuff. I'm looking at the larger questions of how to build a community. Right. According to this vision I've been given, what kind of process can I create to get out here and get feelers, find my level 5 leaders, and put this thing on track and grow this thing? And really become a big part of this community. We have to change perceptions that other people have. If we don't set a narrative, people are going to do it for us.
Yep.
And that's really critical for church leaders to look at today. Who do we want to be in this community? What are we about? And are we making a difference? And this is where it starts. So those are a lot of large questions. It takes a lot of heavy lifting. It takes a lot of conversation. But when you enlist the whole community in it, and you start bringing your board in, and you start bringing your level 5 leaders in, more hands makes the work lighter.
Mm.
Well, Russell, you've hit a really big deal here. And I think this is integral in Jim's work, as I understand. We've had bad models, I guess. We've been taught leadership is we got to have all the right answers. And so there's this autocratic model, and what Russell and I teach is transformational leadership. And it's the culture of building leaders. And so the leader is the inspiration, the influencer. And so we have, we don't have a flock. We do have a flock, but we don't herd them like sheep, not in today's world. So the autocratic model is not something that succeeds. And I was just in Fort Lauderdale a week or so ago and remembering Coral Ridge when it was the big TV church, and then the other coast was just in California, Crystal Cathedral. Those are both built around a personality. And then when those people died, both of those ministries crumbled, rather than creating this culture of high performing. So Russell, you've just exposed some big deal pieces of leadership fallacies. I've got to have the only answers, and we have the scarcity mentality too. We have the scarcity mentality. We can't hire a good accountant. We can't hire a good coach or consultant. We can't get a person that's an expert in this. We got to figure it out ourselves. So I've thrown a lot of things at you, Jim, but some of these are fallacies of leadership. Do you see that often?
Yeah, and what you just talked about, the scarcity mindset, and you think about it, the one place that you would think that would not exist would be in the church. You know, because I don't believe God freaks out over green pictures of dead presidents. You know that there's not enough money, but that is prevalent in a lot of churches. Just that we can't, because we don't have, rather than looking at what we do have and what we can do. And I believe this again at my core, that if you're called to do something, if God's called you to do something, you have what you need among you to get it done. It is really, and in the scriptures, there's this image, a very powerful image of the body, and that's what the church is. And there's different parts with different functions, and it works when the hand's not trying to be the ear, but is being the hand fully. And for us to really have this abundance mindset, that we have what we need. It can be a scary time. Todd Bolsinger wrote a book a couple of years ago called Canoeing the Mountains, and he used this story of Lewis and Clark. And it's just so powerful because he talked about their expedition, and they believed when they crested these mountains that there was going to be a waterway that was going to take them gently to the Pacific Ocean. They believed it so much they had canoes with them. And then when they crest the mountain, they see the Rocky Mountains. And, they were not at all prepared for it. They weren't equipped. But he uses that story to say, when you're in that situation, that's the decision point. Now what? Do we go back? Do we quit? Or we abandon the canoes and we get some people who are going to help us be able to traverse those mountains? And that's where I know the church is, and it's probably a lot of organizations in our world that are at that same place. What we thought was going to work, or what used to work, doesn't work now. But then there's the leadership moment of now what? And do we just sit down and cry, or go back, or do we forge on?
Absolutely. And I use the model, obviously, as a conductor of an orchestra, and the conductor, and they're all consummate leaders. They're very good. They're very good at what they do, but we don't tell them, we don't hire a good oboe player and tell them how to play the oboe. This micromanaging thing doesn't work. And we do have a lot of leaders that think we have to give people every step of the plan and spoon feed them, when really it's not what they want at all. They want to be able to use their brain. Now, Russell's been holding back. He usually has some really thoughtful questions. He has really good observations. But Russell, we're coming to our last 10 minutes here. I want to make sure you get one of your really profound questions in for Jim around whatever topic you've heard, or one we haven't started yet.
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of good dialogue around what we've covered so far, and it's really important to look at where we are in every aspect of society, So, and I had a thought that I lost. But what I would like to ask you in your conversations with others, because from my practice, we believe that you're manifesting results. Whether you're taking action or not, you're manifesting results. Inaction can result in people leaving the church. So in terms of dealing with churches, have you found that a lot of them are working toward having their congregations look at all of the practice in their practices in a practical way, applying what they're learning to their daily lives with a positive expectation? Are you running into communities that are able to do that? And where do you see that um, as being a possible solution, making spiritual practice practical on the daily level for folks?
Yeah, where I see it working is where pastors do not, as we said a few minutes ago, they don't see themselves as the answer person. They are giving spiritual leadership to the church. They're casting vision, but they recognize that there are other parts of that body that are necessary to carry that out. And one of the things that is maybe not unique, but is definitely characteristic of a lot of pastors is, and I struggled with this some myself too. We like to be liked, and and sometimes in leadership, you don't set out to offend anybody or anything like that. But leadership, sometimes it gets a little bit messy, and this reticence to really lead and challenge, it can come difficult to a lot of pastors. I mean, it's hard when you realize, okay, if we do this that we need to do, there are going to be some people who aren't going to carry my picture in their wallet anymore. And yeah, I definitely see where I see churches really growing and becoming effective is where the pastor is there as a visionary leader, but there is ownership of that that vision that will survive beyond them. Hugh cited a couple of examples where when the leader left or died, it crumbled. Jim Collins' work, he talks about that it's, it's not the charismatic leader that makes those organizations successful for 100 years, because nobody lives that long.
But pastors, I've got this group of people, I call them truth tellers. And they're the ones that are going to tell us about our superpowers, but they're going to tell us where our kryptonite is too.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's sort of the pastor has a spiritual mandate to be that truth teller in the lives of people that turn to him or her. Mm-hmm. And so that may not win you any popularity contests, but by teaching people how to live scripturally based lives and to take their faith and put it into practical applications, which is what I think my community does, is something that's very useful. People have to see that the work that the church is doing is still relevant and it matters and it has an impact on their lives. And I think that that's true. And I believe a lot of people have lost sight of that. And so with the church that returns to its roots and say, hey, we are here to be spiritual, to provide a beacon of leadership and excellence in our communities for people through spiritual practices. This is not mythology. This is stuff that has practical applications in the lives of people. And we're here to serve, love and serve one another, and we can make things better.
Yeah.
So we started out this interview with thinking about leadership. And what I see, Jim, is that pastors really Not only have they not studied it seriously, like they study Greek and Hebrew and some of those things they study in seminary, they don't really have a style of leadership in mind. And what I discovered in 40 years of working in middle management as a music director is that transformational leadership is the core of a culture. And we look at the servant leadership. Servant, we have to be a servant before we can be a leader. But really, that inspires preachers to be passive. When really charismatic leadership is autocratic leadership. It's about me. The transformational leader is in fact charismatic, but it's about the vision, not about me. Mm-hmm. And it's about us being the cheerleader and the encourager for people. And so go back to understanding. I don't know if transformational leadership is something you embrace or not, but we find it's we're the champion for the culture performing at a higher level. And I first stumbled on this in the church in St. Pete. Art Ross was my pastor, and he said, we're the leadership resource for the people in the trenches. We don't do it. We resource them and help them do it. So speak to the paradigm of leadership as we're wrapping up here. And what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And what you're talking about with transformational leadership and it being charismatic about the vision. I think that's just so key. The church that I was blessed to plant, I knew I wasn't going to stay there forever. I really wasn't worried about leaving that because I really did believe that the people who were a part of that were there because, some of them liked me, but, they were there because they believed in what we were doing. And that is, I see that in a lot of churches where that is, there's an ownership of that vision. It's not just dependent upon, the one person who could get hit by a bus. And I remember time in that church, we just moved into our new building, and we were having it was we called it something else, but it was the equivalent of a vacation Bible school. Lots of kids from the community were coming, and one of the things that we had as a core value was that nobody's turned away. And I was walking down the hallway. I wasn't in the meeting. They were having a planning meeting about this coming up. And I just overheard, and somebody in the room said, well, we'll have to set a registration limit because we can only have so many people in the building. And I did one of those little turn on my heels and, headed back toward the room. But before I could get there, somebody spoke up and said, no, we don't turn anybody away here. What can we do? And they ended up running, 4 or 5 of these outdoor tents so that, people could come. And, it was one of those times where I realized, hey, it's not just me. It is this, this vision is held by everybody here. And I think that is churches that are growing and growing in a healthy way. It is not about the leader. It's about the vision that the leader is cast.
I see that Sandy's on the call. She's watching you in hidden. She's the acquisitions editor for Nonprofit Performance Magazine. And that's a written version of this. So you're going to get an invitation to write for the magazine. So there's lots of good specific data here. And before, I'm going to give you a chance to leave a closing thought with people. I want to talk about our sponsor, WordSprint. WordSprint helps us stay in touch with our tribe. We use mail. People have something in their hand. So if you're in a church or in a nonprofit and your donations aren't consistent, maybe you're not being responsive to people by letting them know what's happened with their money. And if you put some in their hands, they're going to read it. So wordsprint.com, go and find out what it's like. You can send emails, but we need to give them some data about what's really happening and why should they be excited about our work. Jim, we're rounding out the hour here. What do you want to leave people with?
I'd like to leave people with the fact that I'm encouraged. I mean, the challenges are real, and there are not easy answers to them. But I really am encouraged. Um, I get to spend a lot of time around some of our young clergy, people who are just coming into this now, and the giftedness and the passion that they bring, and not in an arrogant way, but in a very clear way. They're not going to settle for the status quo, and they're not throwing out all of the tradition. They're actually reclaiming a lot of that, and uh, just really leading well in the future. It makes me feel great about the future of the church. But then also, I'm working with some people who are, just 3 or 4 years from retirement, and rather than coasting or having a calendar where they're marking off days, I mean, they are really committed to experimenting, innovating, doing what they can do with the time that they have remaining to help people be reached by the grace and love of God. And it's just encouraging to see people across the age spectrum who are willing to do the hard work, willing to risk failure, willing to try some different things. And it really does encourage me.
Being encouraged, that's great. Russell, you heard it here. We got to do something different. So thanks, Russ, for your thoughtful comments. And Jim Chandler, it's an honor to know you and know that you're out there in the trenches, coaching pastors and church leaders and being their best self and responding to God's call. Thank you for being on the Nonprofit Exchange today.
It was a pleasure.